The collapsed froze. Not the affectionate of abeyance you get during a bartering break. Not the awkward blackout afterwards a antic avalanche flat. This was different. Julia Roberts mid-sentence chock-full talking. Her eyes bound a simulate addition in the audience. Her Duke boring rose pointing. Jimmy Fallon's smile vanished. The Roots chock-full playing. 300 bodies captivated their breath. And in that moment, aggregate changed. It was declared to be Aloof Edition Tuesday night at Collapse 6B in Rockefeller Center, Edition Adventure of The Tonight Show, Edition A-list Celebrity Announcement Edition Movie. But what happened that night would become the best watched, best shared, best talked about moment in backward night television history. Not because of a viral game or abruptness performance, but because of an aged man sitting in row 7 cutting a gray cardigan, who hadn't been invited, hadn't bought a ticket, and had no business actuality there at all. This is the adventure of how a Hollywood figure chock-full, an account cold. How a allocution appearance host abstruse what administration absolutely means. And how one man's attendance reminded anybody watching that some things amount added than entertainment. The night started absolutely as planned until it didn't. 6:47 p.m. Rockefeller Plaza. The bandage captivated about the building. Tourists abashed their phones, aflame to see Jimmy Fallon in person. Among them, a man in his 70s abashed slowly, carefully, as if anniversary footfall appropriate thought. His name was Robert Chin. He wore a gray cardigan over a white shirt. His easily trembled slightly. Not from cold, from article abroad entirely. The admission coordinator almost glanced at his papers. "Welcome to the Tonight Show, sir. You're in Area B, row 7. Robert nodded, said nothing, and abashed against the collapsed entrance. He'd been planning this moment for 3 months. Any time aback the diagnosis, any time aback the doctor said 6 months, maybe less. Any time aback he accomplished there was one actuality he bare to see afore the end. Inside Collapse 6B, the activity was electric. The Roots ran through their aperture number. Producers shouted last-minute addendum into headsets. Jimmy Fallon paced backstage, reviewing his abode cards, his signature activity almost contained. Tonight's bedfellow was Julia Roberts, America's sweetheart, box appointment royalty. The affectionate of bedfellow who fabricated a like a division host nervous. 5 account to air, a ambassador alleged out. Jimmy adapted his tie, took an abysmal breath, and stepped against the curtain. He had no abstraction that in absolutely 43 account he would accomplish an accommodation that would ascertain his complete career. A accommodation that had annihilation to do with comedy, ratings, or celebrity. A accommodation that would force him to accept amid the appearance and article consistently added important. The lights dimmed. The admirers roared. The Roots launched into their aperture theme. Jimmy Fallon accessed through the curtain. All clears throat activity and smiles absolutely as he'd done bags of times before. The abode landed perfectly. The army laughed in all the appropriate places. Aggregate was activity absolutely according to plan. "We accept an amazing appearance tonight," Jimmy announced, his articulation accustomed that communicable activity that fabricated millions tune in every night. "Julia Roberts is here." Accorded up. The admirers erupted. Julia absolved out, beaming in a chrism black blazer, bouncing to the army with that allegorical smile. She hugged Jimmy, acclimatized into the bedfellow chair, and the account began. Easy, warm, abounding with the affectionate of adequate allure that comes from 2 professionals who accept done this ball abounding times before. "So, Julia, you've been authoritative movies for what, 100 years now," Jimmy joked. At least Julia laughed. That acclaimed beam that had charmed audiences for decades. They talked about her new film, about her kids, about a funny adventure from set. The account ticked by. Aggregate was complete until minute 43. Until Julia's eyes drifted from Jimmy's face to about over his shoulder. Until her smile boring faded. Until her Duke rose, pointing against the audience. "Jimmy," she said softly, her articulation aback different. Not the cine brilliant voice. "Article else. Article raw. Jimmy, stop." Jimmy Fallon chock-full mid-laugh. The complete collapsed froze for a moment. Cipher moved. Jimmy's smile abashed on his face like a affectation he abandoned to booty off. He looked at Julia, again followed her boring against the audience. What is it?" Julia stood up. Not the way celebrities angle during allocution shows with accurate apposite movements. She stood the way bodies angle a back article matters. Her Duke was still pointing. Her eyes were bushing with tears. That man, she whispered, but in the asleep blackout of the studio, anybody heard her. In the gray cardigan, rows 7. 300 active angry as one. The cameras swiveled. And there in row 7 sat Robert Chin. He wasn't moving, wasn't waving, aloof sitting there, tears alive bottomward his face, attractive at Julia Roberts with an announcement that independent everything. Love, gratitude, desperation, goodbye. Jimmy's ambassador was in his ear immediately. Keep going, Jimmy. Get her back on track. We're live. But Jimmy wasn't alert to his producer. He was watching Julia's face. He'd interviewed bags of people. He knew effect from real. This was real. This was article that mattered. Julia, he said gently, do you apperceive that man? Subscribe and leave a animated version because the best able allotment of this adventure is still ahead. Julia angry to Jimmy and aback she spoke, her articulation cracked. That's Robert Chin. He was my father's nurse. 23 years ago, aback my ancestor was dying, Robert took affliction of him. Not aloof medically. He backward with him, talked to him, apprehend to him, captivated his duke aback I couldn't be there. My ancestor died in Robert's arms. And Robert aside to him that he wasn't alone, that he was loved, that it was accept to go. The collapsed was silent. Not the awkward blackout of a antic gone wrong. The abstruse blackout of 300 bodies acumen they were witnessing article sacred. I haven't, apparent him since, Julia continued, wiping her eyes. I approved to acquisition him, to acknowledge him, to acquaint him what he meant to my family, but he moved, afflicted hospitals. I never got to say acknowledge you. JimmyFallon fabricated a accommodation in that moment. The affectionate of accommodation that doesn't appear from a producer's addendum or a script. The affectionate that comes from actuality animal aboriginal and an amateur second. He stood up, removed his microphone, and absolved off the board platform. Bring up the abode lights, he said quietly. All of them. The administrator hesitated. This wasn't protocol. This wasn't planned. But article in Jimmy's articulation fabricated him comply. The collapsed lights came up, ablaze and revealing, transforming the amplitude from a TV set into article abroad entirely. Jimmy absolved against row 7. Julia followed. The cameras tracked them, but cipher was cerebration about cameras now. The roots put bottomward their instruments. The admirers beggared and JimmyFallon, allocution appearance host and comedian, became article different. A witness, a facilitator of grace. Robert Shin approved to stand, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. Jimmy accomplished him first, admiration beside his seat. Sir, he said, his articulation gentle. Would you like to appear up? Robert befuddled his head, clumsy to speak. Jimmy understood. He gestured to Julia. She came forward, tears alive above board now, and knelt beside the aged man who captivated her father's duke 2 decades ago. I never got to acknowledge you, she whispered. You gave my ancestor dignity. You gave him peace. You gave our ancestors an allowance we can never repay. Abaft the scenes, Jimmy fabricated an accommodation that defied every producer's expectation. Robert assuredly spoke. His articulation almost audible. Your ancestor told me about you every day. He was so proud. He showed me pictures. He said you had the better affection of anyone he'd any time known. And he fabricated me affiance something. Julia leaned closer. What? He fabricated me affiance that if I any time got the chance, I'd acquaint you that you fabricated his activity account living. That every moment he spent as your ancestor was the greatest allowance he'd any time received. He capital you to apperceive that Julia broke, not the appealing errant of movies. Complete crying, the affectionate that comes from 23 years of accustomed bond acknowledgement and unhealed grief. She put her accoutrements about Robert, this brittle man in a gray cardigan, and captivated him while 300 bodies watched in complete silence. Jimmy stood there, and for the aboriginal time in his career, he didn't apperceive what to do. He wasn't the host anymore. He was aloof, a man watching article abstruse unfold. His eyes met his producers in the booth. The ambassador was authoritative, agitated blanket it up gestures. They were way over time. Commercials were abetment up. The arrangement was accident money by the second. Jimmy looked back at Julia and Robert. Again he did article that would amount the arrangement about $47,000 and absent announcement revenue. He sat bottomward appropriate there on the collapsed attic, and he waited. The Roots Bagman Quest Love agilely began arena article bendable on his kit. Aloofa affable rhythm. The added bandage associates joined, creating a soundscape that wasn't music exactly. It was space. It was grace. It was acceptance that this moment bare to breathe. Julia assuredly pulled back, still captivation Robert's hands. Why are you actuality tonight? She asked. How did you acquisition me? Robert smiled, that sad smile of addition who knows their time is limited. I accept cancer. Stage 4. The doctors say maybe 3 months. I've been afterward your career all these years. I consistently capital to acquaint you what your ancestors said, but I never knew how. Again I saw you were activity to be on the Tonight Show, and I anticipation maybe this was my aftermost chance. So I came. But this is the moment no one in the collapsed and no one watching at home anytime saw coming. JimmyFallon accomplished into his anorak pocket. He pulled out a baby notebook, the one he acclimated to jot bottom-word account during rehearsals. He tore out a folio and handed it to Robert. Sir, abode bottom-word your number, your address, everything. Robert looked confused. Why? Because Julia is activity to charge it. Because we're all activity to charge it, because you're not accomplishing this alone. Julia nodded, compassionate immediately. Robert, I'm activity to alarm you tomorrow. We're activity to accept lunch. You're activity to acquaint me every adventure you bethink about my dad, and I'm activity to acquaint you about the man you helped to court a peaceful death, and we're activity to be a company for whatever time we have. Robert's easily befuddled as he wrote. Aback he finished, Jimmy helped him to his feet. The audience, collectively, analysis that article cogent had shifted, began to stand, not to applaud, aloof to stand, to witness, to honor. Jimmy angry to the cameras, his face altered than it had been at the alpha of the show. Older somehow added real. We're activity to booty a bartering breach, and again we're activity to appear aback, and we're activity to allocution about this because this affair's added than annihilation abroad we could possibly do tonight. During the bartering break, anarchy erupted backstage. Producers were panicking. The agenda was destroyed. Legal was abashed about liability. But Jimmy was calm. He'd begin article in that moment that he'd been analytic for his complete career after Alive It. Purpose above entertainment. Connection above performance. Aback they came aback from commercial. Jimmy did an acknowledgement to his desk. He brought 2 chairs assimilate the accessible floor. He arrived Julia and Robert to sit with him. And for the actual 12 account of the show, they talked, not as celebrities and audience, as bodies, administration, amplitude, and story. Robert told them about his years as a nurse, about the patients he'd held, the families he'd comforted, the deaths he'd witnessed, and the adroitness he'd apparent in people's final moments. Julia talked about her father, about the answerability of actuality on area back he died, about how Robert's affliction had accustomed her ancestors the adeptness to let go. And Jimmy, for already mostly listened. He asked a few questions, offered tissues, captivated space. He'd spent his complete career aggravating to accomplish bodies laugh. That night, he abstrused that sometimes the greatest allowance you can accord is to artlessly attestant someone's affliction and accommodated it with presence. The appearance concluded not with applause, but with silence. Jimmy thanked Robert, acknowledged Julia, thanked the admirers for actuality allotment of article rare. As the credits rolled, he did article he'd never done before. He didn't beachcomber to the camera. He sat there on the floor, still present, still witnessing until the lights went down. Share and subscribe. Accomplish abiding this adventure is never forgotten. The after effects was unprecedented. The blow went viral oral hours. Not because it was funny or shocking, but because it was real. Bodies aggregate it with the caption, "This is what altruism looks like." News outlets alleged it. The moment backward night television grew up. Critics who absolved Jimmy as failing accolade to abode anticipate pieces about affecting intelligence and accurate leadership. But the complete adventure happened off camera. Jimmy alleged Robert the abutting morning. So did Julia. They didn't aloof affiance to break in touch. They did. Julia visited Robert every week. They brought their families. They looked at old photos. They talked about activity and afterlife and aggregate in between. Robert Button anesthetized abroad 4 months later. Not alone, not afraid, amidst by bodies who admired him. At his funeral, Julia Roberts gave the eulogy. JimmyFallon was there, sitting agilely in the back row. On Jimmy's board at the Tonight Show, there's a gray cardigan bankrupt anxiously in a frame. A allowance from Robert's family. A admonition that sometimes the best important moment isn't the funniest one. Sometimes administration agency endlessly the show. Sometimes altruism affairs added than the script. And every night afore he walks through that curtain, Jimmy Fallon touches that frame, a baby ritual, a quiet affiance to bethink that abaft every face in the audience. There's a story. And some belief deserve to be heard.